Ever since the 1970s, with hit films like Straw Dogs and The Shout, British home invasion has had a distinctly different vibe to American home invasion, and very often tends to cross over with folk horror. In British film, often the homes are part of something bigger and more menacing, a village or community that's harbouring a dark secret or a dark history. In 2021, director Lee Haven-Jones made The Feast, a Welsh-language horror movie about a wealthy family's home being invaded by someone with dark, vengeful intentions. The film felt current with its social satire and eat the rich themes, but also somewhat classic with its roots in Welsh folklore. A year later, British writer-director Alex Garland made Men. A strange, otherworldly film about a woman escaping her past traumas and staying in an Airbnb in a remote English village, only to find her safe space invaded by violent, predatory men. Similarly, this film worked perfectly as a very current post-Me Too social commentary, whilst also feeling akin to classic, terrifying British folk horror.
Why are you doing this?
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss Lee Haven-Jones' The Feast and Alex Garland's Men.
Scrumping, eh? No. Mustn't do that. Forbidden fruit.
Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in our 9th season exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we're very nearly at the end. We're on part 33, and we're going to be covering 2 movies released in the last couple of years. That's The Feast from 2021 and Men from 2022. Both of these discussions will be in-depth and spoilerific, so please give both films a watch before you listen to our discussion. They're both weird and wonderful and excellent. So joining me to discuss these 2 fascinating films, I've got a returning guest. He was last here in our vampire series discussing 2 weird, brilliant art house vampire movies, Abel Ferrara's The Addiction and Larry Fessenden's Habit. And he's back. He is a doctor of horror, a lecturer, a writer, among many other things. It's James Rendell. Hello, James.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Thank you so much for being here. Here to discuss home invasion. We've been discussing home invasion all year, so I feel like I've kind of got slight PTSD from it at this point in the year, you know. But let me ask you your thoughts on it. What are your thoughts on home invasion as a subgenre?
I love it. I really, really love it. But with the caveat that it's also perhaps one of the most frustrating subgenres. You and I have talked in the past about films that are doing something different or can really impact you in certain ways, and I think when home invasion gets it right, like, boy does it get it right. It really kind of, it stays on you, but I think with that, there are a real glut of home invasion or home invasion adjacent horror films, and I think they try and do what the masters do so well, but I think they don't fully earn it. So for me, I think home invasion, given that it's the home and that domestic setting, there's often an inherent kind of melodrama in those films.
Yeah.
So I feel like the films that do that really well, that use melodrama or sort of the drama of relationships in a really clever way. So something like you've talked about The Invitation, but something like The Apology as well. That's a really great film that does something really clever with a kind of family dynamic and trauma, or even something like The Boy Behind the Door. Really kind of emotional, has a real gravitas to it. And then I think that other home invasions, they try and use that, but it's not really earned. So there'll be a kind of throwaway scene at the beginning where someone's cheated on someone or there's been some kind of loss. So
yes,
it's that very much kind of like they're cheap to make, aren't they? They often need a couple of characters. So that's the kind of the kind of frustrating side. But then I also really like those home invasions who are like, right, we're not going to be melodramatic. We're just going to be kind of just powerful pieces. Something like Silent House, for example.
Oh yeah,
Or Angst. You know, I hadn't seen Angst until you put it on this for this season, and I was like, what a film! That like really knocked me for six. Or something like Soft and Quiet. You know, these are abrasive films, you know.
I recommended that to you, didn't I? And I remember you messaged me saying, didn't you watch it like over breakfast or something, Soft and Quiet?
I've been for drinks with you and Becky Dark, and
right.
you were like, don't read about it, you know, don't watch the trailer, just go. So I've got a morning off, I can just chill out. I'll have my breakfast, I have my muesli, and I think I just text you saying, holy fuck.
Yes.
It's
yeah.
So that's really it, isn't it? There are these films that you know, and I think for me, films that have really stuck with me beyond that viewing experience have largely been Home Invasion. You know, Martyrs or Inside, Nothing Bad Could Happen. All these films that are really powerful pieces. But what I love what you've done with this season is that you've really kind of played with it and thought about home in different ways. So, you know, the kind of comedy home invasions as well.
Yes.
So it's not like Mum and Dad, you know, the Nicolas Cage.
Yeah.
You know, or Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. You know, there is this... I like the humorous side to these as well. So, you know, on paper, you think, right, we know what a home invasion is, but you can move it in such different ways. You know, like those films, you know, a bit like, you know, The Feast Today, where you're rooting for the intruder.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, something like, you know, I Came By or Hard Candy, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there is so much that's going on with them. So yeah, I really, really love them. I think they're really great.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's been really fun seeing that kind of broad scope that you can, you know, that you can play with what really constitutes a home invasion, I think, and, you know, the way in which different filmmakers use the home. And I think you're right about the melodrama. You know, it goes all the way back to its kind of roots feel like they're in melodrama. You know, in the early days of this series, we covered films like Gaslight and, you know, those kind of like what they called at the time women's pictures and that kind of thing. But there is this kind of root in melodrama, I think, to these kind of domestic set horrors or thrillers, you know, and that is definitely carried all the way through to now, isn't it, for sure?
Yeah, definitely. I think there is... you know, they are in many ways sort of the identity dynamics of the characters play out as part of the horror within these various films. And I think both the films that we're going to talk about today are really good examples of that.
Yeah, and like I think that's the two films we're going to talk about as well kind of do sort of straddle different subgenres too. I'm sure we'll talk about this as we go, but they both feel just as much kind of folk horrors in a way, right, as they do home invasion. So I think that's really interesting too, you know? Yeah,
I mean, that hybrid... you know, and they do that so well, that hybridization of genre, kind of folk horror or kind of eco horror, home invasion, it's a real interesting mix that I think also that comes at a really interesting time for horror in general. You know, the last couple of years we've been really fortunate with the types of films that are being made by really interesting filmmakers, and I think both of these, you know, one as a debut and one as a kind of third film, really speak to what we've been seeing.
Well, I don't think I've ever included so many films from the last like 5 years in a series as I have during this home invasion series, actually, because it feels like even just in 2022 alone, like we've already mentioned Soft and Quiet, Bodies, 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 there's Barbarian. There are so many movies that kind of constitute some kind of home invasion or kind of domestic set movies from the last sort of handful of years as well. And I don't know whether that's a response to COVID, lockdown, or if it's a coincidence, or if there's just been this kind of other kind of trend. But it really feels like we've had a lot of them recently, you know? Yeah,
that's a really good point. I think, certainly the idea of home ownership, I think, is another interesting thing, you know, with the cost of living crisis, and actually, you know, something like Men, but also, you know, films like Superhost or The Rental, where we're in properties that are not ours, but are still, there's the kind of experiential culture that we want, or leisure, and I think that's quite disarming as well, isn't it, being in a house that's not your own, and we're also seeing, other films like 1BR, where again they're kind of moving into a kind of community, the space that's not perhaps your own.
Yeah.
And we are starting to see, I mean, I do hate them, that kind of glut of, they're kind of like Home Invasion, but not the kind of where the home itself becomes the monster, the kind of, like
yes,
the AI or the internet
right.
things like Margot and Tao and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's they speak of a time, don't they? And I think the house and what the house can be in a kind of wider cultural setting is quite important as well. But as you say, with COVID, Men was made during COVID, and thinking about it, then it feels, you're looking at the make of it, feels very much like a COVID-y kind of film.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And actually, so does The Feast in a lot of ways,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's true.
Speaking of, let's get into it, shall we? Let's begin our deep dive discussions with The Feast from 2021.
Matt gwlydd yn aros amdano ni.
Pwy hon?
Mae'n gweithio I ni heno. Paratoi bwyd, gweini, cyda'r castri.
Mae'n rieni mor.
This is an interesting little film, isn't it? So this was written and produced by Roger Williams and it was directed by Lee Haven-Jones. Came out in 2021. It's a Welsh language horror film. James, just set us up. Give us a little plot rundown for The Feast.
Okay, so I've been working on this all morning, so hopefully this does it justice. So a local woman by the name of Caddy joins a highly dysfunctional and loathsome family in the pricey second home as hired help in preparing and waitering for their exotic feast for a business party and neighbours in an attempt to further exploit the beautiful landscape. But is Caddy there as an extra pair of hands, or is she serving the Welsh wilderness? Is she there to let them eat cake or let them have it?
Love that. Excellent description. Very, very good. So now, James, I think when we last met up, we were talking about home invasions, and I think it was actually you that suggested this to me, this movie, as like a good one to include in the mix. Tell me a little bit about why you think this movie is a particularly interesting one to kind of discuss. What's your kind of relationship with this film?
So I was aware of this film sort of in its kind of production. There was, a lot of the Welsh press was picking up that it's Welsh language, and a lot of films are made in Wales, but normally are English language. And a number of horror films as well have been made in Wales, but to have something that's Welsh language, and I think that's really important in terms of some of the politics or kind of things that it's saying about Wales and people from Wales and its relationship to England and that kind of stuff. And then I watched it at home, and it's one of those films, and I think like Men as well, some films are great for the cinema, that kind of collective experience, kind of popcorn and fun, and there's some films, I think Home Invasion is a good example of that because of their setting, but just watching that by yourself in a kind of darkened room is really powerful and really draws you in, and so yeah, it's a really wonderful film, and it's another film that it really lends itself to repeat viewings. I think you can always you can draw something, you can look at it in different ways. You can look at it as a kind of Trojan horse kind of horror, or a kind of folk horror, kind of fable in many ways, or this kind of eco horror, and I think it's a real credit to the filmmaker that it is this very small, compact little story, but there's so much you can draw on it, that you can pull on it.
Yeah, completely agree with you. I agree that's maybe why also we've had a wave of these sorts of movies over the last few years that coincided with the kind of Netflix and streaming era, right? It feels like these movies are perfect to watch at home. I watched this film at home for the first time. I think it was when I was covering South by Southwest from remotely, the festival, and this movie was one of the films. So I saw it, from home remotely, but for its kind of world premiere. So I remember knowing nothing about it really at all. Like, I hadn't even read a plot synopsis, and really being taken on this journey of like, what is this film? Where is it going? Is it going to be some sort of monstrous Invitation-esque dinner party? Is it going to be something more than that? Is there something supernatural? And it really kind of it's an ambitious film, actually. It's going for a lot, isn't it? It like, for such a stripped back movie, kind of one location, a family, it feels like it's juggling so many themes, doesn't it? And so many kind of areas of horror and you've already mentioned, folk horror, eco horror, a kind of Eat the Rich movie, obviously a kind of home invasion as well. It's got like all these elements to it, doesn't it? In a very kind of tight 90 minutes. It's really interesting.
Yeah, really kind of balanced. And I think, for a directorial debut, all of that could have been loud and verbose and very showy off, but the mixture, the kind of alchemy of those different subgenres is really balanced. And as you say, it's the pacing of it, you're almost speeding the film up because you're wondering what's going on, but it keeps it at that pace that I think speaks to our kind of protagonist Caddy. The way that she holds herself and conducts herself in the film is very kind of controlled and measured and curious.
Very much
and
so.
I think that the pace of the film follows her rather than the kind of horror or of the family.
So it's a very quiet film, actually, isn't it? There's a lot of kind of quiet menace and dread to this film. So where to start? Maybe we should start by talking about the fact that this is a Welsh movie, because I feel like this is probably the first time ever on this podcast I've actually covered like a Welsh language film on the podcast. We don't get many of those, right? How important is that in terms of this story that it's telling? It's Welsh identity, I suppose, and the kind of Welsh folklore and everything that's behind it.
So I think it's really, really, really important. I think to kind of think about the family that we centre on, they're Welsh speaking, and the backstory is that this so Glenda, the mum, she's inherited this farm that's been there, and all the kind of the acres that go with it, and they've built, they've demolished the farm, they've demolished the past, the tradition, the working class, the heritage of the land, in favour of building a second home, and with that, then that the husband Gwyn, who's just an awful human being, he's a politician, or he represents the local constituency in London, and I think that this being in Welsh and Welsh language speaks to, I think, Wales's relationship with England and the history and heritage of that relationship. If this was in English language, I think part of that might have got lost slightly.
Right, yeah.
But Wales is a devolved nation. It has its own parliament, the Senedd, but also it's still very much tied to English politics in many ways. So it can set a lot of its own laws, but a number of them are still controlled centrally. But just the kind of legacy of Wales being kind of controlled by kind of imperial power has a really long heritage. And then you go into things like industrialisation and business, things like Margaret Thatcher closing down the mines. There is this antagonistic relationship, and I think the idea of maintaining Welsh culture and through Welsh language as well is being emblematic. I think that really speaks to the importance of some of the politics that are being played out, because the Gwen, he's not really serving his locals, is he? He's using this place to exploit the land, and for his own purpose, and all the kind of characters of that family, and Euros, the kind of business partner, and Euros translates as gold, that the name itself. So I think, again, the kind of folky, fably side of things, all of that speaks to a kind of Welsh heritage and history, where one of their reasons they're being punished, I think, is because in various ways they are exploiting or neglecting Welsh heritage and history. Glenda, she talks about her past, but kind of forgets the songs that her mother sings, and she the kind of flowery dress and all this kind of stuff, it's all put away. It's very much about, they're not there because they love Welsh culture or heritage or history. They're there as tourists,
Absolutely.
and they treat it as such, and so I think the Welsh language and the kind of folkness of it speaks to that dynamic of those in Wales that are kind of forgetting Wales in favour of the kind of powerful other, just across the border.
And you see that, don't you, in Wales? There are huge
well, from my knowledge at least, huge chunks of Wales where they don't necessarily speak the language or whatever. You live in Wales yourself, James, right? You're talking from Cardiff right now. Do you know much of the Welsh language? Do you need to speak or know much of the Welsh language where you are in Cardiff?
Not at all. It's a really interesting dynamic in terms of Welsh culture where, on the one hand, particularly in the south, kind of closer to certain parts of England, it's not a widely spoken language. It's more kind of mid to North Wales. It is more prevalent and popular. But with that, there is, so when they do kind of opinion polls, even though many Welsh citizens, and I'm not Welsh, but I consider myself Welsh, there is the recognition that the Welsh language is still very, very important.
Yeah.
So things like S4C, the Welsh language channel on TV, a lot of people who don't speak Welsh will still watch that channel because they value the Welsh language, and there is a real push, a kind of cultural drive to encourage children from a very early age to learn Welsh. So you have to do a Welsh GCSE and stuff like that. So yeah, I think there's an interesting dynamic or relationship with it where many people from Wales recognise its importance, even if they don't speak it themselves, as kind of the wider cultural fabric of the country.
And it feels kind of perfect for folk horror too, right? I mean, there are, we talked about this a little bit in our folk horror series. I remember talking about stuff like the Owl Service, but Wales has a kind of, it does seem to have like such a rich history and folklore, doesn't it? That kind of feels like it's untapped in the horror genre, broadly.
Yeah,
it feels
so,
like.
I mean, it's very much a kind of the land,
yeah,
rural countryside that has a kind of working class heritage to it as well, that's kind of working off the land and living in a kind of symbiotic relationship with it. And I think that's something, again, that the feast is talking about, is the greed and gluttony and exploitation of those things that can provide for you, rather than living harmoniously with it. Maya, the neighbour, she is a farmer herself, but it's not exploiting the land in the way that this family are. So yeah, I think that idea of the return to the rural, and again the kind of legacy of Welsh heritage there lends itself to folk. I mean, I'm surprised it's the first Welsh language film horror that's doing this.
Yeah. I know. I mean, unless there are others that I am just not aware of, but it felt like that was a real thing when this movie came out, didn't it? Like, this really interesting, Welsh language folk horror.
Yeah. So there is a film that came out in the 90s called Darklands, and that came out in 96, and that was set around Neath and Port Talbot, so you're sort of moving towards kind of Swansea way. And that's a kind of folk horror, kind of Wicker Man-esque film.
Nice.
But the difference between that and The Feast, I feel anyway, is that this comes out in 96. So it's very kind of New Labour, Cool Britannia, and you follow in English a kind of London journalist who's been sent to there to do reporting because I think he's messed up or something, back in civilised modern London, and he's now kind of in the Welsh backward, and it's all about kind of Druid culture. And again, it's very kind of Wicker Man in that kind of sense. But what I love about The Feast is that you are aligned with the celebration of the local Welshness, even if it's monstrous.
Right, yes.
You're rooting for Caddy because the family are so awful, and they have this kind of part of their un-Welshness is their alignment with England in terms of politics and money, and their kind of exploitation or denouncing of that local identity.
Yes,
I love that.
And let's talk a little bit about this family then. Like, I think, as well as kind of folk horror and home invasion, which we'll get into, there is also this feeling that it fits very firmly in this very popular trend that we've had over the last few years of this kind of eat the rich type horror subgenre as well, right? These movies like Parasite, Get Out, to Ready or Not, to a whole bunch of other movies. The Menu, of course. I feel like there are a lot of similarities between this and The Menu from last year too. But what do you think of the portrayal of this kind of as you've already described them, quite monstrous family, I suppose, right?
Yeah, so they all kind of display individual forms, I think, of grossness and otherness that pertains to various forms of destroying the land. And again, I think it's important to sort of hark back to that idea of it coming from a denouncement of the locals. So you've got Gwyn, who's he's mining the land, and that's literally our first shot, isn't it? That we have the kind of oil or the minerals shooting up, and it has that kind of almost like a kind of piercing sound. It's not just quite the machine itself. It's like the ground is screaming at him.
Yeah, it's very There Will Be Blood.
Yeah,
actually, isn't it? It's like a Daniel Plainview type character in a way.
And then his worker kind of falls to the ground bleeding, and I think that's the instigation of the rise of our monster that's Caddy. And then you have Glenda, who's from this part of the world, has her whole history there, her mother, and she's forgot it. She's repressed it kind of physically and materialistically. She's built over, which again is a kind of folk horror thing.
Very,
the farm, and then you've got Gwerth. The Welsh language, some of the pronunciations I'm going to absolutely butcher. I can only apologise to my.
You're doing better than me, so well done. Yes.
He's the older son, so he's the one that was a doctor or training to be a doctor, and has stopped to do a triathlon. And again, that's very kind of like you could help other people, but instead you're going to look at yourself in the mirror and touch yourself in this kind of masturbatory.
I mean, he is awful, isn't he? From the very first time you see him, you just think he's an absolute wrong-un, isn't he, that guy?
And then you've got Guto, who's the younger brother, who again is such a cliche of like going to London, probably lives in Camden, in indie music, wannabe working class drug addict.
Thinks he's kind of different and better than the rest of the family almost.
But they're all doing awful things, aren't they? So it's alluded to that Gwerth as that he's potentially a kind of rapist, particularly of women through his job as a doctor. And then Guto, we see chopping the wood again, kind of destroying the land, and kind of his attitude there. And they all kind of get their comeuppance.
Yeah.
Their comeuppance is relational to that.
Right, that's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so Gwyn, the dad, he's mining the land, and also, he doesn't care what the locals say, so it's very much about like not listening or
yes.
And he gets this kind of tinnitus, this high pitch when Caddy comes along, and that kind of escalates into the skewer. Which very much reminded me of kind of Audition.
Oh my god, so much so. It's a real, and we'll get to this, but there are some wince-inducing gore and body horror in this film. And then Glenda, her kind of her comeuppance is really this the past comes back. Literally, she kind of sees her mother and the return of the repressed, and I think you can read it more ways, like has she become possessed by her mum, who then kind of shoots Eros and then also slits her own throat, which makes me wince. And then Guto, the axe falls on his foot. My god!
And I think I missed it the first time, but I think it doesn't drop. I think that's Caddy. I think she has these kind of telekinesis supernatural powers that makes it drop. Same when Eros, the wine bottle drops on the ground. I think that's her and her power. And then Gwerth, his comeuppance is obviously kind of sexually related in terms of what he did. So
honestly, like the payoffs in the second half of this film, and that's I never even thought of that you're right, that each of the way they are picked off is kind of linked to their character and their behaviour. That's so interesting. I hadn't noticed that. That's awesome. Well, we'll come back to these characters as we go, but let me ask you again about the home in this movie too, because obviously this is such a big part of home invasion movies, and the architecture and the kind of production design and the look of this house itself. How do you think that fits into this particular story? Because I guess what we've got here is it's the polar opposite, right, to your kind of big old Gothic dark house. It's this clean line, ultra modern glass kind of swanky nouveau riche kind of house, isn't it, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a real, I think, often we say with these home invasions or domestic space horrors that the house is a character, and I think actually in this case I think the house isn't a character. I think it's a representation of characters' relationships. I think it is about the family who are all siloed individuals that do not care for one another. You know, there's no pictures on the walls of like family photos. It doesn't feel homely.
There's absolutely no warmth to this home whatsoever, right?
That's emblematic of them and how they treat the countryside. But it's really interesting because I thought, this house must have been made for the film, because it's made to kind of stand out like a sore thumb in many ways. But it's an actual house. It's
wow.
I'm not going to try and do the Welsh translation, but it's called the Lifehouse, which is in a place called Llanbista, which is in Mid Wales. And if you go onto the website, you can actually book to stay on there.
Amazing.
But it's designed by a guy called John Pawson as a place for calm and reflection. But it does feel, I don't know if now I've seen the film, I don't think I can feel it that way.
I wonder how the owner feels about this movie then. If this house is designed for calm reflection.
Yeah. Come here, we'd love you to film. And what you film? Oh, it's a horror film about how horrible your house is. Oh, great, thanks.
Great.
But yeah, the use of glass, particularly in the film as well, quite often with the mise en scène that's used to kind of, again, you have these shots where one of the family members will be outside and the other one will be inside, and they're kind of looking at each other, and it creates that kind of barrier. And I mean, you've talked about it a lot throughout the series. Like, glass is such an interesting dynamic in terms of status and wealth that pertains to a house, doesn't it?
I've noticed that more and more. That's become very apparent to me, that the richer the house, or the richer the family that own the house, the more glass there is. And it's like been a really interesting thing to kind of notice and explore as we've gone. You know,
I mean, that's why I'm putting it out there that Barbie is a home invasion film.
Love this, love it. Yes,
Ken is home invading, right?
And
there's no windows in that house.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
Amazing.
But yeah, the history of glass itself has been frequently linked to wealth and status. You know, historically, glass was really, really expensive. So only the most affluent people within society could afford it. And then with industrialization, it becomes cheaper and more malleable, and you can do more with it. But I think in relation to the feast and these kind of houses, particularly in countryside settings, I think there's a combination of spectacle, asking passers-by to sort of observe the wealth of within, because these are big houses that they can't live or attain. But I also think that these kind of houses, it allows those that are wealthy to survey the land. It's a kind of God's eye view, isn't it? That it's a very much kind of we control this space. We are the center, and in the feast they talk about the map, and that the black square is the house itself. So I think part of it is about not just people looking in, but very much that the house itself controls the space around it. And I think that's where the glass and the kind of use of it in such big, I don't know, arrogant ways is it's saying something about how somebody locates himself within the wider space around them.
I think you're absolutely right. And, this feeling of like, this is my kingdom that I shall look over and look upon, But I think that's what's really interesting about it, and why it works so well for these kind of horror films, is that you have... It's like during the day, that's the case. During the day, you can stand inside and see out. But at night, you can't see out and anyone can see in, right? And like it's flipped on its head as soon as it gets dark at night, traditionally in these kind of glass homes,
It's that vulnerability, isn't it? That again is quite satisfying for those kind of the rich narratives, that the kind of arrogance to have this notion that your house, which again is a reflector of your character, is about you looking outwards, but as you say, and I think this film is very much about, on the one hand, what this family is doing to the environment, but Caddy becomes this kind of conduit for the outside coming in to the house in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely that. And it's weird as well, isn't it? The colour scheme of this house. Like, I when I picture it in my head, there's a lot of just like really, really dark black walls and things, you know, like that basement corridor, that kind of shower spa room. I suppose it's like you're in some sort of modern spa break, isn't it? It's like that kind of a place almost. Again, just absolutely no warmth or personality to it, but just like sort of dark and plain, you know? It's really strange.
Yeah, you get that in the first shots, don't you, where the first shot is Glenda in the kind of sauna kind of
that's right
room.
Yes.
That's and you've kind of got the orchestral, or almost like kind of choir, religious kind of soundtrack playing, and then you have Gareth who's looking at himself, and it's so cold and it's so isolating, and she's showing off the house, isn't she, to the neighbour Maya, and she shows her the kind of wet room, I think, or kind of whatever it is.
Yeah.
And she's like, it's like a prison.
Yeah.
And that's really what it is. You know, they are a slave to wealth and the kind of greed of capitalist want.
So you've got this horrific family in this plush home, and then we're introduced to Caddy, who kind of emerges as our home invader, I suppose, who comes to this house initially kind of proclaiming to be the kind of hired help, right? The kind of the who's going to like serve this dinner party. What do you think of Caddy as a character in this kind of performance throughout?
I think she's brilliant.
She's amazing, isn't she?
Really, again, that real nice balance of, there is that kind of almost like is it under the skin, that kind of the kind of character that's almost learning as they're going through.
That's right. That's right.
You know,
yeah.
she's very in tune with the land. You know, when she hears the gunshots, and she kind of, I think she feels them when she sees the death of the rabbits, and the way that she kind of, but then that kind of sensory, it's almost like a sponge, and she's taking it all in, and she feels the painting, the kind of tactileness, and the way that she, you know, she tastes the food for the first time, and so there's this kind of naivety to that, but then there's also this power, this simmering power underneath. And I think to be able to pull that off as a performance, it's really well done.
So good.
It's when she just watches, you know, she's serving the table, and she's just there with the skewer, just quietly watching, and then it's really fantastic.
And she's so kind of ethereal, isn't she? And even though she is technically kind of, I guess, what we'd call the monster of this film, she's not, right? I mean, like you said at the beginning, you're kind of rooting for her throughout, aren't you? Even though she does some pretty unspeakable things to this family as the film goes on.
Yeah, she doesn't really say anything for like the first 20 minutes.
No. Nothing. No, she's just very quiet and pensive, and she's a bit kind of manic pixie dream girl almost, isn't she? But kind of, but like this kind of like witchy version of it, you know?
Yeah, that's it. That's actually come from nature rather than from, you know, Gwyn Norgreth's imagination.
Exactly. Yeah.
She has that kind of quiet power about her, and then it kind of escalates, doesn't it? Where she's quite good. She's manipulating the various characters as well. You know. Guto wants drugs, so she lures him into the woods and gives him the mushrooms, and you know, Gareth wants sex, so she takes him to the rise, you know, the kind of folklore thing about the rise, and you mustn't go there, and so they kind of get what they want from her, which is again how they treat the land,
exactly,
and that's their downfall.
So obviously this film is called The Feast, and it's all set around a dinner party. We've talked about a lot of kind of dinner party horror movies this series, because it's it feels like such a kind of common theme in a lot of particularly modern horror over the last 10 years or so. I think this movie feels particularly kind of visceral and focused on the food, right, and the eating. There's a lot of like people reaching their hands into their mouths and like pulling things out, and there's something I'm not good with kind of food horror, you know, and there's a lot of food horror in this. How do you find that the portrayal of the fine dining and the food itself in this?
The food itself, I think, again speaks to the kind of Welshness of what the film is trying to say. You know, Glenda's quick to say that the local village shop doesn't sell like bok choy, or that she's importing food in, which again is about, you know, just not respecting the land, and then we get Eros come, you know, the kind of businessman for the feast, And he brings his red wine, which presumably from France, and in his BMW, his German car, and his Italian shoes, all non-Welsh things.
That's true.
But just the way he eats and devours, that greed is just, he's so. And then you come back to like Maya, who's very kind of takes her time and has a small appetite. She's very respectful. I think speaks to that, speaks to their characters and how they treat each other and the landscape. But yeah, the abjection of the meal is just, like Gwerth eats the kind of raw meat, and he calls his parents vampires, and I think, but the kids are also like that as well. Guta then in rage kind of shoots up more mushrooms that are also blood red. So I think there is this kind of, as you say, that the feast is something that they're trying to construct as a kind of another kind of spectacle of wealth and power, isn't it? And it's meant to be alluring to Maya, that they've invited her because they essentially want to trick her into selling the land so they can farm it more. So they're kind of
they're seducing
trying to wine
her.
and dine.
Absolutely.
And Caddy's not like letting her do that in many ways, because she kind of interjects many times. The bit where Eros pulls, I think, is it hair or string out of his mouth?
Honestly, it's disgusting. It's so prolonged as well. There are a few moments in this film that make me like nearly gag, and that is one of them, that pulling the hair out of his mouth.
There's something about pulling something out of mouth. It's like when evil lurks as well. There's that bit in it that's just the kind of it's things that we shouldn't be consuming that we are consuming, and it's and you get it again when so Gwerth is choking, isn't he? And Caddy has to sort of pull down into his mouth. Which I kind of maybe is a kind of a reversal of the kind of sexual violence he does to other people. It's part of maybe that. And then she pulls something out that it looks like it could be hair. It's not meat, is it? It's something. It's a real quick shot, and then it cuts to her cleaning and tidying away. So it's a very kind of. It's grotesque, isn't it? That's really what it is. This kind of spectacle of eating and appetite, which again it becomes Eros's downfall, doesn't it? He doesn't stop eating.
Exactly that. Yeah, I love that. So we've kind of teased it quite a lot, but let's talk about when the shit hits the fan in that final act, because again, this movie does not hold back on really, really gnarly, visceral gore and body horror. There are certain moments of this. I think everything that happens to the drug addict boy, right, from sticking the needle into his own foot is really, really gets me, to then the rotting leg with the maggots and then her eating them. Like, all of that is unbelievable, isn't it? How do you find just how kind of abject and visceral this film gets in its final act?
Yeah, I think because the film stays so quiet and restrained, the kind of dread and tension that builds up, and then it's like, the shit hits the proverbial fan, doesn't it? Where, just the shot in between the toes, and then he's in agony. He's sort of essentially kind of ODing, or his legs got infected, and she tears it away. And it's very kind of quick shots. And then it shoots to the next thing, and so it's worse in your mind, isn't it? And then Caddy licks his leg, which I think is possibly one of the most disgusting things, because it's not like Evil Dead 2. It's not kind of splatterpunk. It's not. It's not a Peter Jackson film. It has that kind of arty kind of more sensibility about it that makes it very kind of much more disgusting.
Much more. It's almost like you can smell that wound. It's disgusting.
Oh my god, it is absolutely foul. And then he ends up on the rise, that this kind of place that they're not to go to. So that's another thing, isn't it? Is that Glenda's saying that you're being superstitious and that it's an old tale, and Maya's like, no, we need to respect the tradition. So he ends up on there. And Caddy leads the other brother up there in the kind of promise of sex, and then encourages him to chop off his brother's leg, and then promptly has sex with him. And she's put the broken glass from Eros's bottle inside herself.
Yeah, fucking hell.
So when Gwerth has sex with her, that's his downfall. That's how he meets his bloody end again.
Oh my god.
I know, we're both just wincing as we're talking about it.
It's just fucked up, isn't it? It's really fucked up. I love it. It's like it's one of the gnarlier movies we've discussed in a long time, actually. And but what's interesting is that it's not. I don't know if I'd say it's kind of as sort of terror, like there's less of that kind of terror maybe than you get in a lot of other home invasion movies. Like I'm not as kind of disturbed or scared by it as I am by, I don't know, Speak No Evil or Soft and Quiet or something like that, you know?
Yeah. I think it's because we're rooting for Caddy, and I think that's the film is constantly reminding us how awful the characters are. So even at the end when, you know, Guto, you know, he's writhing in pain because of his legs infected, and then he still says, you know, he's the one that lets us know that Gwerth is a rapist, and Gwerth's response is very aggressive and kind. So, you know, it's all these things to their very, very end, they're still really awful people who get their comeuppance, isn't it? So maybe that's why it's not so scary in that sense. It's more, as you say, the shockingness of the scenes, and it's not like it's a torture porn film where it's kind of spectacle, high octane, and lingering on it. I think because there is that slow build, that slow burn. I mean, in many ways, it's like a meal, isn't it? That we have the kind of quiet, we have the starter, we then have our kind of big set piece meal, and then quietly we go into our dessert at the end. I mean, that's another way of thinking about it.
It's true, because the film is kind of separated into chapters too, isn't it? In that way,
chapters.
It's kind of separated into sections in that same kind of way. So you're right, actually, and there is there's almost a slasher element to it too, in a way, isn't there? There's the kind of body count of people being killed off and punished for their sins, almost.
Yeah. And in very different ways, isn't it, as well? That's the kind of the interesting ways that they all get their comeuppance. As we're kind of saying, you know, Gwyn's the piercing in the ear at the end is just, you know, and also he kind of wants it himself. He's in so much pain now, the pain he's caused other people, that it's almost his kind of relief there. But really, really shocking stuff for a quiet film.
Yeah, it sneaks up on you, doesn't it, this film? It's you know, you kind of think you know what you're in for when this film begins. Okay, it's going to be quite a kind of quiet, pensive, kind of more maybe psychological type of movie, and then just like, holy shit, by halfway in, you're like, what am I looking at?
Yeah,
you know?
Definitely. And I think that allows it, you know, I've watched it quite a few times now, probably 3 or 4 times, and every time I watch it, that it still gets to me in that same kind of visceral way. But I mean, I don't know about you, but you know, I've watched Hostel quite a few times, and after a while, you're like, do you know what I mean? I think that the power for it, the ability to be powerful and impactful, I think Dwayne it falls away quite quickly.
Absolutely, yeah.
Whereas actually, this film, credit to it, it still keeps it going. You know,
it packs a punch.
Yeah, definitely.
And finally, like, you know, we've already mentioned this film does it's juggling a lot here. It's doing a lot in its kind of short runtime. You know, this is in many ways a kind of ecological horror. As we've already discussed, it's kind of an Eat the Rich. It's a folk horror. It's a home invasion. It's a kind of body horror, slasher type element to it as well.
Yeah.
Do you think is it doing too much, this film, or is it kind of successful for you in kind of, you know, telling its story and kind of, you know, carrying all of these big meaty themes?
I think it does do it well. I think, as you say, it could be seen as a kind of scattergun approach, where if we throw everything in, then we're going to get something original, and then we don't. And again, that is perhaps sometimes where home invasion, because people try and do different things with it and it doesn't pay off, it's because you can see the working out done too overtly.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think it is a very subtle film, and I think, you know, you could watch it and each time look at it from a different kind of subgenre and get different pleasures out of it. You know, the first time I watched it, I think I texted you and just said home invasion versus folk horror, like, holy shit, this is great. And then you start researching it, and then I think it becomes as a kind of folk horror. So, you know, I was doing some research around it, and you can read kind of Welsh mythology into it as well, that you're only going to get if you do kind of wider reading. So there's a Welsh mythological character called Blod Deiweth, which means flower-faced, and it's a kind of Mother Earth figure. And that's kind of this, isn't it? It's a kind of a cautionary curse story that Caddy's come back because of what people are doing to the land. And then you do another kind of reading, and there's another myth, a kind of Lady in the Lake story that's not King Arthur. It's called Lady of Llynfanfach, I think is how you pronounce it, which is based in Carmarthenshire. And this is a kind of story of a young man falls in love with this kind of figure he finds in the water, and of course Caddy returns from the lake, doesn't she? That's the kind of twist of the story, yes. that she's this kind of other supernatural being. And in this tale, he falls in love with this Lady of the Lake, and she kind of comes to him and marries him. And promises him wealth. That's the main thing. He's a kind of farmer, and she promises him wealth, providing that he kind of looks after and isn't aggressive to her and all this. And the kind of the long and short of the story is that he doesn't. He then becomes abusive. But the ramifications of it is that she leaves with all the livestock, and he becomes poor.
Right.
It's a capitalist story. It's
right.
a kind of warning to those kind of greed stories and wealth stories. And I think that this film isn't directly referencing that, but I think it fits within that kind of lineage or mythology of cautionary tales and mythologies of how you treat the land and how you respect the land, and that's another important part of Welsh heritage and culture.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think in some ways these themes kind of feel like they marry each other very well. Like they're all part of that same vibe, aren't they? And so it does feel like it works, and it does feel organic to me. I completely agree. Amazing. Well, what I think we should do, James, at some point is rent this house and host a little screening there. What we could do, get some people in, we'll host a dinner party, and then we'll project the film outside.
We'll get some veg on skewers, and have some fish, and
maybe
and
some raw meat.
We haven't even talked about the bit where Caddy gets the rabbit out of the fridge.
Oh my god!
And promptly throws up on it and then puts it back into the fridge.
Oh fuck me! And let me tell you, as a bunny owner, there was a lot of triggering rabbit horror in this film. Can I just say, I feel sorry for the rabbit.
I'm sweating just thinking about it. It's disgusting.
I kept hearing noises in the hallway.
It hasn't reached me yet, but it's on its way. I feel like I can't do anything.
I think Ellie saw a ghost. I didn't have any rational explanation for who was in those photos.
Something was happening inside that house, and I wanted to find out what it was.
There was a ghost in our house.
Now, while we're on the subject of Wales and Welsh horror, I've got something very exciting to announce for our Welsh listeners, because that little clip you just heard there was from one of my all-time favourite horror movies, an absolute perfect, terrifying film as far as I'm concerned. It's Lake Mungo from 2008, a film that was relatively unknown when it first came out, was very difficult to get hold of for a number of years, and even now it's not been seen as widely as it should be for what I would consider to be one of the greatest horror films ever made. Now, on the 17th of December of this year, I am going to be coming to Chapter Cinema in Cardiff, and we are going to be screening Lake Mungo. This is a rare opportunity to see this movie on the big screen with an audience. I could not be more excited. I've never seen this film on the big screen before. It's one of my absolute all-time favourites. Lovely Claire, who is a listener of the podcast but also runs the Chapter Cinema in Cardiff, she emailed me to say, I've just watched Lake Mungo, and oh my god, what an incredible film. Thank you for recommending it on the podcast. And I replied immediately and said, shall we screen it? And thankfully Claire was up for it. So yes, this is going to be, I guess you could say, a Christmas ghost story screening, because Lake Mungo is a ghost story. It's not the most happy or festive story in the world, but I will be coming to Cardiff on the 17th of December. We will be screening Lake Mungo at Chapter in Cardiff, and afterwards I'm going to be joined on stage by none other than this week's guest, James Rendell, who is a resident of Cardiff and big Lake Lake Mungo fan, and we are going to be discussing the film in depth on stage. We'll also be discussing it with audience members. So please grab your tickets while you can for this very special, very rare treat. Come and hang out with us in Cardiff. We're going to watch Lake Mungo, talk about horror films, have a lovely festive time. Grab your tickets, head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events for all of the details and for links to the ticket page. That's evolutionofhorror.com/events. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode as James Rendell and I discuss Alex Garland's Weird and Wonderful Men from 2022. And I will also just offer a trigger warning for this film, as it does deal with some quite disturbing gendered and domestic abuse and violence.
You're tormented.
It feels more like...
haunted.
Yeah. Something happened. My husband went upstairs to our balcony and let himself go.
You must wonder why you drove him to it.
Why? I didn't drive him to it.
I thought it'd be true. But if you had given him the chance to apologize, he'd still be alive.
What?
Visiting Gloucestershire to escape the grief and trauma of domestic abuse back in London, Harper's stay in a rented country house as she explores the rural landscape brings her face to face with the Green Man and his repeated manifestations in the local males. Thus, a trip that attempts to allow Harper to freely live and find herself results in her residing in a property that is not hers nor her home, forcing her to relive her violent past and tackle the many iterations of toxic masculinity.
Oh, lovely. And actually, I've got some... That's interesting. I think some of what you said there in your plot synopsis and the way you kind of interpreted the plot is kind of interesting too, which we'll get into. But first of all, just let me start off by asking you, James, what do you think of Men? What do you think of it as a film generally?
I love it. I absolutely adore it. And I think... as part of the preparation for the podcast, I've been revisiting lots of like Garland's work in his films, and you know, when I first saw Annihilation, I had to go for a walk. I had to walk it off because like the sensory,
oh, what a film,
splendor of it and the soundscape. And I watched it again. I was like, oh, it's still there. It's still kind of. But I think with Men, first time I watched Men, I was like, oh, I like it. I like it as a film. It's good, visually arresting, and similar to his other films in set pieces and making you think. And then I watched it again. I was like, oh no, I really like this film. And then I watched it again. I was like, oh no, I really love this film.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's every time I find new things that I like about it, and I really and again, as with The Feast, I watched it at home. It was by myself in the dark, and it really kind of draws you in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really does. It's I think it's a bonkers film, and I think sometimes when I first watched it, you get a bit taken aback by certain elements of what happens in this film and certain performances, and I think sometimes it's quite funny, right? It's quite absurd and it's funny, and I wasn't quite sure how to take it initially because I was like, well, this is kind of fun, but is it just also a bit ridiculous, but I think
a bit right. League of Gentlemen.
It is a bit League of Gentlemen. Like somebody commented when I posted on Instagram that I was watching it, and somebody said, the whole film feels like a elongated Little Britain sketch and stuff. And I can see why people would think that in a way, right? It has that kind of mad absurdity to it in a way, and I think purely because of the Rory Kinnear performances, right? I think that's what makes that happen. But I think also there is also so much to it, and I think the performances are so good. I think Alex Garland's I think he's amazing, actually. I love his storytelling, and I love the way he directs as well. And I think it's a bit of a shame, actually, that he's slightly fallen out of love with it. He talked a lot in interviews after Men. I actually interviewed him about it, and he sounded pretty down on himself. Like I think he's a bit done with directing. I think he's got one more film coming out, and then he's like, never.
That Civil War one.
Yeah, and he was just like, never again. I'm not doing this again. Like he doesn't enjoy it, I think, which is such a shame because I think he's a tremendous director. He's so good.
Well, yeah, 100%. We talk about Peele and Eggers and Ari Aster, and those that they've all done 3 films and they're all brilliant. Garland's 3 films are stunning, and I think they all speak to each other. They're quite focused on gender relationships and gender identity and meaning around them in different kind of subgenres, whether that be kind of sci-fi or eco or, you know, the kind of folk horror home invasion that we're talking about today. And yet he doesn't see himself as a director. You know, I've read pieces where, you know, he sees himself as a writer, you know, and that's where he comes from.
Absolutely,
But it's a real shame. And I mean, he's really against the kind of term auteur as well. He doesn't see himself as an auteur, you know, that Men was a collaborative process with the actors. Because I think it is an interesting dynamic that obviously this is a straight man talking about, you know, issues, domestic issues and violence towards women. And I think maybe that was some of the pushback against the film, was that, do we need a man telling this kind of story? And I think we can unpack that in many different ways and look at that from different angles. But, you know, when you start to look at the nuances in it, and that's when I think it's a lot more complicated. I mean, he said he didn't want it, although it's kind of ham-fisted, he's like, it's not a lecture. He wants it to be a conversation, and that you can read the film in many, many different ways.
I think that's the one thing about it that you might not necessarily appreciate initially, right? I talked about Mother a couple of weeks ago on the series, and we you know, Darren Aronofsky's Mother, which in some ways is a very powerful, visceral film, but also it's kind of like, all right, we get it. We get what you're saying in this movie, you know, basically in the first act, and then it just pushes it and pushes it and pushes it. And there's an element to this film that I think can be perceived like that too, right? Like almost, you know, not to use this word, I don't really like this word, but a bit basic maybe. That is a film about men, and it's like, okay, we get it. All men are the same in terms of Rory Kinnear. They all want the same thing. They're all variations on the same kind of monster. You know, is this movie more than that, do you think? More than that kind of very simple men equals bad, I guess, kind of a theme.
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is more than that. I mean, I'm aware that we are
two men,
two straight white men,
yeah,
able-bodied, who are giving their opinion on whether how feminist this text is. I think on repeat watches, and when you start to look at, I think not just focusing on the male character, but on Harper, and I think how it uses folk horror, and particularly the Green Man and the Shiel Nagig, the female folklore character. I think once you start looking at the relationship, and also the things like the use of colour and everything else that goes in, I think it's a really layered, complex film.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, it's a very antagonistic title, though. Even something like Men, it's a very blunt instrument to squeeze up men, and you can hear people who saw the poster be like, well, it's not all men. It's like, but I mean, it's, if you think, I mean, things like gendered violence or abuse, they don't always have to be subtle films, because it's an important issue. You know, this is a film that came out around COVID, and we know that during lockdown restrictions that the increase of domestic abuse increased. So between April and June 2020, there was a 65% increase in calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline compared to the first 3 months of that year. 5% of the population has been a victim of domestic abuse. So it's still a really important issue, and I think that Men is trying to deal with that. And I think in some, at first watch, as you kind of said, there is almost a kind of caricature element to it that I think maybe is why it feels quite ham-fisted. But I think when you keep watching it, I think it does give a lot more compared to something like is it Watcher? That home invasion film.
The Micah Monroe one.
I mean, that's an incredible film, but I think that perhaps is talking about similar kind of issues in a different way, and using a different kind of visual language to do that, particularly kind of through soft focus and or even something like Fresh. I think all these films could kind of sit together quite nicely.
And Fresh wasn't subtle in what it was doing. It wasn't subtle with its subtext. It wore its messages and its themes on its sleeve. Same with Barbarian. This commentary on all the different types of toxic men that you get out there. Barbarian was doing that in a very overt but very fun and entertaining way. And I think you're right. Sometimes when the message is important, when it's dealing with something vital, it doesn't need to be subtle. Sometimes subtlety isn't the answer when you're dealing with something as important as this.
Yeah, and to have things that are very at the fore, particularly around the kind of domestic abuse and toxic masculinity, and then having things in the background that you can see the more subtleties or the nuances or thinking about this in different ways, that maybe the film is trying to work through the kind of legacies of toxic masculinity and how that reproduces itself and where it starts, or what are the kind of catalysts. I mean, in some ways, if you think about a film like Get Out, Get Out is very overtly about specific forms of racism, and we're all aware of that. You don't have to study film to deconstruct those kind of messages. But then if you watch the film again, there's so many subtle nuances.
Incredible.
And I think Men is in a similar kind of vein doing that kind of thing. There's the overt text, and then I think there's the other things that it's wrestling with. And Garland has said, his friends constantly think they've worked out the film, and he's like, well, if that's what you think it is, then that's what it is. And maybe it's about holding a mirror up to people. The things they see might reflect their experiences or the way that they've behaved or that kind of stuff.
For sure. I mean, this is the other thing. I suppose there are men that could watch this, and we might have to reckon with our own behaviours sometimes by the way in which these different men are portrayed. Whether it's something really, really tiny and passive aggressive to the odd awkward throwaway comment that comes from the character of Jeffrey or whatever. There is something recognisable in all of these men that are portrayed. And maybe we should talk about that. Let's talk about this choice then. Alex Garland basically cast the great British actor Rory Kinnear to play every single man in this film, other than Harper's ex-husband, right? He's played by a different actor, but every man in this village that she meets is played by Rory Kinnear. He's in different makeup, he's wearing prosthetics and various other things, but it's very clearly him. Now, I'm really interested in something you said in your plot synopsis just now, because when you described the plot, you said this is the story of the Green Man and him taking various different forms of different men in this village. That's a really interesting thing. I hadn't really thought about it as something that was actually in the text, in the mythology, that all of these men look the same, because there is maybe something folkloric or something kind of supernatural or whatever going on there. Tell me a little bit about kind of what you meant by that.
So I think this speaks to the bluntness and the complexity of the film. The Green Man is kind of seen as a symbol of rebirth.
Yeah.
And I think
this is obviously the character that is the naked guy, right? That kind of lives in the earth.
That's
and has
it.
all of
the kind of foliage on his face.
Yeah.
It's a figure historically that precedes Christianity. It's a figure that's been seen all around the world, and then kind of feeds into Christianity. So I think that's kind of important as well. It's kind of sometimes seen as, particularly within folk horror, that Christianity and pre-Christian faith perhaps sometimes are in opposition to one another. Yeah. And I think one of the smartness of this film is it's not just playing with those strict kind of binaries. I think it's actually looking at continuation and patterns. And again, if you think about the way that the city, and often the city dwellers are often put in opposition to the village, we don't have that dynamic here. I think it's about a continuum or a spectrum that Garland's playing with. And I think the Green Man is emblematic of that he's a figure of rebirth. But whose rebirth are we talking about? Are we talking about Harper's rebirth, that she's gone here because of trauma and grief and she's trying to work through it?
Yeah.
Or is this about the rebirth or the continual evolution or perpetuation, almost at a kind of DNA level, of toxic masculinity that's being played out and borne out time and time again? And there's those beautiful shots where she goes for walks and you get these kind of long shots really far back, the whole of the landscape's there, and it kind of looks like the face, doesn't it? The trees and everything kind of looks like the Green Man. And so it's that kind of pre-man, that everyman. But I also think part of it is about, is this figure potentially part of part of Harper as well. And I don't have an answer. I think that's that the film is leaving that purposely ambiguous.
I love that. I never, because I always just assumed, I've always looked at this as a kind of fun meta commentary on men, in that, it was Alex Garland's choice to cast Rory Kinnear as every single man, as a way to kind of nudge, wink, wink at the audience. I never actually thought about it as an in-world story point, that all of the men maybe in this village all look the same for a particular reason, and linking it to that kind of folklore and to that green man myth is fascinating. Yeah,
and I think, to your point, that certainly that potentially if you're dealing with trauma and that kind of abuse or the fear of those things, that in that sense, who are those monsters and who aren't, and if they all become the same, don't they? And even dear old Jeffrey, who seems quite harmless on the surface, has this part to him. So I think it has those kind of overt ideas that they're perhaps all in cahoots as well in some way. So there's a Garland talks about the kind of micro and macro aggressions that happen within the film.
Yes.
And there's real little subtle ones, like when the policeman, who also is played by Rory, picks up, so he's arresting the Green Man, who's kind of seen as this kind of homeless drifter. And Harper's phoned because she's being stalked by someone who is naked and also tries to break into the house. So 3 real reasons that women have to deal with toxic masculinity in terms of their safety, unsolicited nakedness or nudity being directed at them. And then he says, "Come on, friend," as he picks this guy up. It's a real I think the film also speaks about privilege, I think. Which I think is really important. So again, it's there's the real extreme ends that we can all recognise as that's toxic. That's it's victim blaming. It's all this other stuff. But I think there are these little nuances where the little microaggressions or power plays that keep Harper a kind of victim in many different ways. Jeffrey says, "We don't lock the door," which feels a kind of very kind of like, Middle England, middle class, bourgeoisie way, that we're all a community, we all get on. But that's a very male thing to say, isn't it? But because of course, when we get to the door and it's not open, that sense of dread is absolutely terrifying. So I moved back to Cardiff when I was doing my PhD, and I moved into a house share, I had my bedroom was on the ground floor, and I had, when you go into a house, you can't necessarily pick who you're living with. No. So you get to live with some quite interesting characters.
Yes.
And one of the people that I lived with, he would perpetually leave the front door open.
Oh no.
I don't know why it was, but he lived his room was on the first floor. So if I came home from studying or a night out, I would come home to an open door.
Christ.
And my bedroom was downstairs, so I would have to go around, and that fear, that sense of dread that the home space, the place where you're meant to be safe, and you're completely disarmed, aren't you?
God,
it's really frightening. So I think that's a really, again, quite a very quick, subtle scene, but very powerful.
Totally.
In what it's doing.
Totally. Jeffrey is a fascinating character, right? Really funny character, and like a really well observed Middle England kind of, I guess, slight caricature type character. But it's, apart from at the very end when he clearly becomes actually toxic and aggressive, the first sort of bulk of the film, he seems kind of harmless, but yet there is like every interaction he has with her, there is that kind of gendered interaction, right? The throwaway joke about the forbidden fruit, to him insisting on doing certain things for her, like carrying certain things for her or whatever. This kind of constant
I'm the man and you're the woman kind of treatment of her the whole time. You know, where's your husband and all this stuff. You know, and I think that is the stuff that's really well observed in this. You know, beyond, like you said, it's the tiny little behavioural things, it's the microaggressions, it's the passive aggressions, those things, as well as the out and out aggressive toxicity is kind of, it's all there in this, isn't it?
100%. I think I read Jeffrey as a divorcee.
Right, yeah.
I you know, the way that, you know, he kind of seems a little bit taken back when Harper says that she's divorced from James.
Yeah.
And that the house is so big and they have loads of glasses in the cabinet, so it's clearly kind of a space for socialising. And he talks about the piano, that he doesn't play it, but it's there. And I was like, someone else used to live here and you've been so awful that they've left. That's the way I kind of... So he has that little chip on his shoulder. You know, he talks about, you know, you mustn't scrump. Yes, that kind of joke. But then he kind of internalises that the apples fall on the floor and the wasps come. It's like that is some layered. You know, he's going through his own shit there. But even the apples, you know, we talk about the kind of folk horrorness of this. There's the overt symbolism, I guess, of Eve,
Adam and Eve,
and the
absolutely.
apple. But it also made me think of the idea that with that story, you have woman, you know, women incarnate, the original sin, and that's what's the decline of human, and again blaming women for all our kind of woes, and then you have the kind of scenes where I think it's the policeman or the various male forms are coming to the house, and all the apples are dropping to the ground. And it made me think that you get an opposite rhetoric. So if Eve is this kind of singular figure and she's to blame for what, you know, for all of humankind, you know, the rhetoric of like, oh, the bad apple.
Yes, yeah.
So, you know, the police officer who abuses his power, or the politician or whoever, and rather than talk about kind of systemic gendered abuse and hierarchy and all that stuff, it's always the bad apple. It's never the tree, it's never the institution, it's never pre-existing privilege, it's always the individual. And if we get rid of the individual, then all the toxicity will go away. I mean, it's that same, and it's always mapped onto men. So I think the tree there and the apples was an interesting allegory for them. And as you say, Jeffrey, who on the surface seems to, you know, kind of like, you know, a knight in shining armour, also turns out to be a real bastard
with outrageous teeth as well. I mean, this is the other thing about this film, is that it's not above some fun, like you say, almost League of Gentlemen-esque comedy, and you've got Rory Kinnear really going for it in these various different performances, right, with, you know, different kind of prosthetics and, you know, teeth and all these different things. What do you think of Rory Kinnear in this movie generally? You know, he just seems to be having the most fun, I think, with these performances.
Oh, it's amazing, isn't it? Because, you know, he's not method. You know, he's not...
No.
But to be able to have such a great range, you know, I find that the vicar really frightening.
Oh, he's
really
the scariest one, for sure. Yeah.
And little things, obviously, like the way they've moved his face, but the different contact lenses. And, you know, the vicar essentially has like shark eyes. There's kind of black. But then he plays the little boy Sam, who has the kind of Marilyn Monroe mask. He wants to play hide and seek.
It's so good. I mean, I can't take that scene seriously, though.
The CGI is a little bit. It's not
so
quite there, is it?
Funny asking her to play hide and seek. It's brilliant. I mean, again,
and then telling the vicar to fuck off.
Yeah. And then calling it, goes fucking bitch, and then runs off.
Yeah,
you know, it is outrageous, but it's brilliant. I love it.
But even that speaks to a kind of, you know, boys becoming men.
Oh, massively.
Who call women like that, and even the idea of hide and seek. You know, he wants her to hide, which is a very disempowering, passive kind of thing, and he wants to be active. He wants to find her. And so, again, I think that's quite a nice nuance. And the fact that he has I think it's a Marilyn Monroe mask or some kind of objectified blonde woman mask that's plastic, and that's what he's playing with. It's his plaything, and he wants Harper to be his plaything. So, the performances are really, really, especially when you think about the kind of how big the scenes get and the kind of various metamorphoses. Like, he's playing them straight.
Yeah, he is.
You know, and that's impressive. I mean, both both actors are really phenomenal.
Well, oh my God, let's talk about Jessie Buckley, because I mean, Rory Kinnear is brilliant in this and he's so much fun and he's doing a great job, but I think it's Jessie Buckley that really kind of holds this film together, right? She's the grounding force, she's the heart and soul of this movie in a way, and she's not playing anything for laughs. She's not doing anything that's caricatured. You know, there's this really, really incredible performance of this woman that is really working through something and has been through something, right? And you know, I find all of that stuff upsetting and gut-wrenching and you know, quite upsetting to watch.
Yeah, I think her ability to sort of play grief and trauma in a really sensitive way. You know, again, there's moments of quiet and moments of control, and one of the scenes that I find really powerful with that is that, you know, when she first goes for a walk and she's going through the rural lands, and it's a really quiet scene, and Garland said that even though he's a writer, those are his favourite scenes where it's silent, and she just seems to be like comfortable in her own skin, and then, you know, then she finds the tunnel.
Oh,
and then
what a scene as well. Incredible.
It's just it's maybe one of my favourite scenes of the film, where she is finding her voice, you know, and certainly the idea within a kind of lot of contemporary feminist literature is about chorus, the idea of kind of female empowerment through collective voice, and the fact that she finds her own kind of collective voice through chorus feeding back to her, and that's her first moment of empowerment. And then you get the shot of the Green Man emerge. He's almost like a reaction to her finding her voice. And the first time I saw that, it shook me, because it's just the landscape, isn't it? And he pops up. It's a bit like you're like in Midnight Mass, where you don't really know where the monster is, and then it kind of moves onto the screen. And
exactly that.
So
It's like he suddenly emerges from the earth suddenly, doesn't he, at that moment?
That's it. And we get that time and time again whenever Harper's voice kind of comes into a kind of powerful stance, whether it be kind of a chorus or when she's crying in the church, and her voice kind of bleeds into the soundtrack and again becomes kind of cruel. The vicar comes along to kind of disempower her, or when she's in the pub and she's talking about that, you know, they've let the homeless guy, the naked guy go, and she's like, why would you do that? He was stalking me. And the policeman's like, well, he didn't steal anything. So, you know,
and she's like, what do I do if he comes back? And he's like, well, just call us again. And it's like, absolutely no comprehension of the danger.
That's it. You know, the property's more important than a female person. But just, the way that she conveys fear, but also strength, you know, in the kind of memories, but also in this countryside. It's a really powerful piece. And she's got all that range in one character, where, you know, as you know, to play different characters, you kind of got the clothes and the makeup and the teeth to you can use that, can't you, as kind of leverage. But she has all of that just in the same person, and again, I think that's, you know, if the one hand, if the film is a bit blunt, her performance is so nuanced that I think that speaks to the layers of the film.
Absolutely.
You know, is she the Green Man? Is she the Shiel Nagig? You know, the colours that she wears green.
So tell us a little bit about that, the Shiel Nagig. What is that?
So the Shiel Nagig is another kind of folk figure of a naked woman that kind of displays a kind of exaggerated genitalia,
right?
And it's often seen sometimes together with the kind of Green Man figure. So again, kind of oppositional but part of the same. And so something even like the fact that the Green Man is green and the Shiel Nagig is kind of red or pink. On a colour wheel, they're in opposition to one another, but they need each other to be opposite. So that's, I think, again, speaking to the kind of relationship that's going on within the film. But also, they are carvings that were seen as kind of having protective magic. So that was another kind of symbol of them. They were protective kind of figures. So you've got the Green Man that's rebirth, and then you've got the Shiel Nagig, which is to kind of use to ward off death or evil and demons. So again, it's been seen as quite a kind of a feminist sort of totem in some ways, because it's about a kind of overt sexuality, but also kind of protecting you from the powers that be. And again, kind of precedes Christianity, but it's been kind of been used in a lot more kind of focus. And Shield and a Gig is an Irish. I think the label itself is kind of Irish,
right.
And I think that obviously the Green Man we recognise, I think, because it's in popular culture, Green Man pubs and the Green Man Festival and stuff. But the Shield and the Gig, I didn't really learn about that until I sort of researched more about the film. And I think when you see that and the kind of colour schemes they recognise, and the fact that Harper often wears both the green of the Green Man and the pink of the Shield and a Gig, I think that gives the film a real kind of layering and complexity and depth that makes it such a fascinating watch.
Love that. I love that. Yeah. And she does have such a brilliantly nuanced performance. And, these little things too about the film, like, she doesn't react to the fact that all of these men are Rory Kinnear, right? That isn't a thing as part of the text too, right?
Yeah.
When she walks into the pub, there's no kind of, oh my God, they're all the same person kind of a moment, is there? Which again makes the film feel even more kind of odd and off kilter in a way that's just kind of taken as read,
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. Yeah, that she's not like, why do you all look the same? I mean, the countryside is renowned for sort of incestuous, so maybe they're all related in some way.
Absolutely, absolutely, it's true. And of course, you do have this like really tragic, gut-wrenching, disturbing backstory to her and her ex-partner, right, played by Papa Seydoux, who again is excellent in this, in the kind of few moments that he has, right? How do you find those scenes, those kind of flashback scenes to her marriage and what happened there?
They're really upsetting, and I think maybe they are so upsetting because they are real, compared to the kind of bombastic nature of the countryside.
Even the way they're shot, right, the lighting and the kind of claustrophobic urban setting, it does feel suddenly like we're one layer more real, I suppose, than almost like fairy tale like visuals,
Definitely. And I think to that point as well, we talked about films that we find quite scary or upsetting and frightening, and for me some of the most frightening films are not necessarily quote unquote horror, but kind of British social realist films.
Yes, absolutely.
So things like Tyrannosaur.
Oh my God.
Or,
Dead
Shane
Man's
Meadows'
Shoes.
films. Dead Man's Shoes. Yeah, or This Is England. Again, lots of violence in the home, and I find them so upsetting. But they are they have monsters. They're about horror. They are very moving in a different kind of way. And I think those scenes, those memory scenes, fit far more in that kind of vein. And the way that he plays out this, he's becoming disempowered because Harper wants to leave, so he falls back on masculinity to try and control her. He talks about that you are going against Christianity. We got married in a church. And of course we have a vicar. The archaic patriarchal pillars that have been used to constrain women,
control
keep
women
them in the house. Completely. And then that doesn't work. And then when she tries to text her friend, he stops it, and we see that play out in the countryside, where when she texts her friends for kind of communal support, again the kind of chorus voice, you get those horrible shots where the phone gets distorted and it looks really monstrous.
So good.
And then he attacks her. He punches her in the face, which I wasn't prepared for, because it's really unflinching and really shocking. And as you say, it's a really powerful moment. And then you see Harper's reaction, which feels so real. And then her power that comes from that as well, But yeah, it's the way that they are kind of intercut.
Yeah.
I think tonally breaks up the film quite nicely. Like, it never gets too ridiculous, even when the scenes you're like, what am I watching? And then there'll just be these tiny clips, whether it's a montage or a little scene being played out. And again, to go back to the colour and the idea of the Green Man and the Shield and a Gig, is that when you see the first interaction between Harper and James, that it's all kind of pink.
That's right.
Kind of red and very oppressively sickly kind of red.
It is kind of reddy orangey.
Which perhaps the Shield and a Gig there is the kind of perhaps pink, but in the background of Harper there are plants, a kind of Green Man, and you see throughout the mise en scène, throughout her flat and the country manor house, you see plants all the time, and they increase. You kind of see the volume of them. They become more empowering within the frame, and I think maybe that is the Green Man, the rebirth happening, coming to a kind of crescendo maybe.
Love that.
Yeah,
kind of, it reminds me of Annihilation a bit too, those kind of visuals, right? And you know, that kind of backstory and that past trauma, it really brought to mind Annihilation and a lot of moments from Annihilation as well. You know, and those visuals too, the body of the husband when he's been sort of impaled on the fence down below. It's a really powerful image. It almost looks like some sort of weird religious tableau or something. Like it looks like some sort of weird kind of statuesque kind of form. But then, of course, like you get repeats of that with the hand being torn in two when Rory Kinnear invades the house, right, as well. So, yeah, there are all these interesting things that are done with the body too, and particularly the male body throughout this, you know?
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's suggested that he either fell from... You know, he's gone upstairs to try and get back into the flat, that he fell, or he jumped maybe, that he took his own life. Or I don't know, if, you know, you could perhaps go one step further and say maybe if Harper is this kind of, if she's embodying both the Green Man and the Shilna Gig, if she has that kind of warding off of evil, that did that make him fall?
Yeah.
You know, because they have that icon, because that's what she's trying to work. She's trying to work through some of that trauma herself. But the way he lands... It's quite unconventional, isn't it? You'd think he'd just kind of splat, or the way, but they say, as you say, the way that it's the trauma to the foot and to the hand. I guess, you know, the trauma to both fight and flight, which is what that dynamic is about, isn't it? In that interaction, it's those are the things that become wounded, and that's the other thing that this film, I think, is dealing with, is wounded masculinity in various ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Well, let's talk about this final act where the actual home invasion kicks in, right? Because actually, and it's quite a big chunk of the film, I was surprised when rewatching it how quickly, in a way, it felt like we got to the home invasion element, you know, because it's a beautifully kind of simple film, and before long it's like, right, it's nighttime and shit starts getting weird, doesn't it, at this point, as all of the various Rory Kinnears basically start to invade this home, and the horror really kicks in, right? And we haven't really talked about the home, but it's this kind of beautiful classic, kind of, if you were to imagine, right, renting a luxurious Airbnb in the English countryside, this is exactly it, isn't it, you know?
That's it. And Garland said they found it on Airbnb.
Of course.
So again, we could do a follow-up to Wales. We'll go down to Gloucestershire and we'll go.
Yes! Oh my God. And I love this.
Do some scrumping.
And you've talked about this already at the beginning, but this kind of like trend of kind of Airbnb horror as well, right? This kind of super host type movies, you know, Barbarian, etc. This is very much part of that, isn't it? But it's a beautiful house, actually. I mean, I would love to go and stay there by myself and
really
just do some
gorgeous
writing or something, you know? It'd be great.
It's, and Garland said he wanted it to be like a Richard Curtis kind of house, that it's very kind of for weddings and funeral kind of bourgeoisie kind of
absolutely.
But he says, you know, that the house is a character, and I think again the use of colour, you know, you go in and it's so red when you first go in, and I think that it is the house is, and again, like a kind of gothic sense, isn't it? It's a kind of manifestation or playing with or representing the things that Harper is going through, you know, in her own life, and you know, and the idea as well that the home is your sanctuary, a safe place, and that she flees back to the house because again she believes she's being followed after she's left the pub, but it doesn't offer that kind of safety. And then
no, not at all.
And the idea that Geoffrey's going to be this kind of knight in shining armor again speaks to kind of male privilege, you know. But then you hear there's that bit where he kind of talks about being like a failed military man or something.
Yeah.
And he's just like, oh, that's what my dad said to me when I was 7. And again, oh, that makes sense.
The cycle of kind of masculinity and wounded masculinity and all that kind of thing. The Green Man himself is a wounded figure, isn't he? He's kind of got cuts in his face, and that he's kind of putting leaves in it. And then it's those various men start attacking. But oh my God, it's great.
The hand through the letterbox.
Oh, so good.
And Harper sticks her kitchen knife in it, which again is kind of very kind of slashery.
Yes.
And you'd think, oh well, that kind of works under. You're expecting the kind of hand to recoil or whatever, and it pulls itself back. Oh
my God, it's so good. And then of course every sort of persona that Rory Kinnear takes on from that point onwards, they always have the hand torn in half, don't they? Like,
yeah, the wounded masculinity,
yeah.
or maybe that James again take his own life, but but they use the wounded hand as well, which I thought was really interesting. So when the vicar holds her when he's about to kind of sit, and he uses his kind of
it's like lobster claw.
But he's using his own woundedness to control her. And it's just again, it really teeters on the edge of being absurd, but also I think it is layered and
it is
and unnerving and unsettling.
It's scary. I think it's genuinely scary, this stuff as well. Alex Garland has always been really good at horror, to be honest, in like the stuff he's written and the stuff he's directed. He's got a real good eye for horror, and this stuff is really powerful, I think. And then of course we have this mental rebirthing sequence. What on earth do you make of that sequence? How do you read it?
So I keep thinking about this in different ways. You could see it in its kind of perhaps obvious message of toxic masculinity being reborn time and time again. From a bygone era as well. That we've had this from the dawn of man. That this is what we've seen. But then if the Shiona gig is also part of this dynamic, is she the one that's kind of drawing them out as a kind of figure that's dealing with it and responding to it in different ways? Because I mean, also every time they're born with the injuries, aren't they? So it's the idea of wounded masculinity coming back time and time again, and it gets the kind of trauma of each body, isn't it? That they're being born in kind of interesting ways, but they also kind of look like the Shiona gig as well, because they're kind of vaginal when they come out.
Absolutely.
So I just, and then the final shot after all of this is that Harper is sitting in the garden holding a leaf. So is she holding the Green Man? Is she the Green Man? But her friend is also pregnant. So it's it's those two women together. So, and
also it's like, what happened really? Did that all really happen? Like, are we to take everything that happened there literally? Because the next morning, you'd almost expect in a lot of other genre films, okay, the next morning maybe there was nothing there, nothing really happened or whatever, or was it all in her head, or was it all whatever? But you kind of feel like you see the aftermath of it. There's like blood stains all over the place, and Harper is kind of covered in blood and from everything that happened the night before. So it's kind of like in the kind of harsh light of day the next morning when that friend arrives, what does she find in that house? I wonder, what happened?
we don't know. Because James is the last manifestation, isn't he?
Yes,
he sits,
that's right.
And he sits on the sofa and they converse. And she has an axe that she's kind of just putting her kind of hand over. But we don't know if she's used it, or does all of this happen when they lock eyes when he falls down? Is she dealing with, if all of this is about going through grief and trauma of just what's happened?
Yeah.
Is all of this an internal escapism or trauma story that's just inside Harper? I don't know. And I think that's why I keep coming back to it. And I think it's really layered and complicated and interesting and fascinating.
Oh, it's great. It's so good. And also it just looks so fucking great. Like, again, these kind of Alex Garland visuals, that birthing sequence, it almost reminds me of the incredible kind of dance at the end of Annihilation, with Natalie Portman and the double. Like, he does these really interesting visual things with the human body and reproduction and all of that kind of thing in such interesting ways,
Definitely. And the soundtrack that goes with it,
Yes, exactly, yes.
It's Ben Salisbury and the other name escapes me now. The guy from Portishead, Jeff Barrow. So they've done all the scores for Garland's work, and they've done stuff on they've done Ben Wheatley's Free Fire, and they did an episode of Black Mirror, and that soundscape that kind of blurs into like being kind of ethereal and then being kind of folky and of the earth, but then kind of being kind of supernatural and haunting, and
so good,
or like an internal kind of screaming. I think they do such a great job of that as a score. Again, something like Annihilation, I think that soundtrack is absolutely
Just one of the all-time best as well. But I love the sound.
100%.
I love the soundtrack to this movie too. And then it ends with Elton John as well. We've got a bit of Elton John's love song at the end there as well, which again kind of really feels like it fits to the kind of folky kind of vibe of that song. You know.
And to back to that point about does this narrative actually play out in the real world, or is it something more kind of
conceptual
that she's dealing with?
Yeah,
because I think there's a folk song that starts the whole narrative as what the whole story as well. And I'm not. It might even be the same song.
There is. I think it is. I think it's sung by a different person. It's Love Song, but by Leslie Duncan, I think. But I think it's the same song. Yeah.
So that's a really interesting. Aspect to the text that we have the same song sung by a man and a woman, which again is a dance, it's a dialogue, it's not just oppositional, it's more complicated than that, which also might mean if the song begins and ends, did all of this happen in Harper? I just don't know, and I think it's that's why I think, you know, it's bigger than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, it is. It's richer than it might initially seem, I think, you know, because I think, you know, when I remember the reaction when the trailer first dropped to this film and the posters, and there was just a lot of, oh my God, this looks hilarious. Just lots of Rory Kinnear with mad teeth in a film called Men, right? And it's like, it looked like it was going to be a bit of a laugh a minute type horror film almost. And there is a lot more to it than that, I think, you know?
Yeah. And it didn't do that well.
No.
I think, you know, it critically, it was kind of seen as mid-range, and perhaps because Annihilation had been really kind of well received. I think a lot of people, they kind of went with the fact that it's not subtext, it's really overt, you know, men, and it didn't do particularly well at the box office either. I mean, I don't know if COVID had something to do with that, but as I say, like, going back to it time and time again, I just adore it.
It's I mean, and I think, you know, it's aside from all of the interesting, meaty thematic stuff, it's a really entertaining film. It's written really well. All of the performances are stunning. It looks as beautiful as everything Alex Garland does. You know, I could just lap up the scenery and the production design and, you know, the performances and everything. The
use of colour and the saturation, you know, in the countryside. The countryside as well. You know, the house is very kind of umptious and kind of over the top, but the countryside as well is just really beautiful and idyllic in many ways.
Yes, it's kind of Eden almost, like kind of countryside.
Yeah, definitely.
Love it. Well, there you go. What a fascinating pair of movies to discuss. Thank you because it was you that suggested them, James, and like I think they work so well as a pair as well, like such interesting kind of themes to explore there. I want to finish by asking you, James, you know, it may be one of these two, it may be something different. What is your favourite home invasion film?
Every time I go back and forth. Can I be cheeky and ask for two, just to play with what you've done in this season so wonderfully? So I think if we were going to fit within the kind of remit of what you've done in this season, a film about the home that is horrifying, I would have to say the film Nothing Bad Can Happen.
I've never seen this. Okay, this is good.
And also kudos to this. I found out about this on the EOH Facebook page. So whoever suggested it, I got a copy of it. It's a German film, and it is up there with sort of Speak No Evil and Inside, and it shook me to my core. It's
oh my God, yes, I remember you telling me about this. Yes, I do need to check this out.
Really, and that should probably come with a trigger warning. That's a really powerful piece of home invasion, but a kind of not being able to leave the home for. But I don't want to say too much. Again, I think you have to see it and let it wash over you.
Amazing. Okay.
If we're being strict and saying you've got to do proper home invasion, I would say it's a toss up between Angst, because that really was like just so interesting how it's crafted and its aesthetic and the monologues and all that kind of stuff, or Inside. I think Inside is a real kind of you know,
pretty perfect
kind of French New Extremity. And the difference between a film that is just about home invasion compared to a film that has a scene of home invasion. You know, Men has, you know, as you say, the last scene is home invasion, but the whole film isn't about it.
No.
But when a film can do a home invasion from beginning to end, and still keep it going, it's that would be those two, I think, are, you know, in terms of traditional home invasion, would be my faves.
Incredible choices. Yeah, you're right. The to pull off a home invasion movie that is just entirely like basically two people in a house, in a quite a small house inside, and kind of sustain that tension and horror throughout as well as it does is absolutely incredible, isn't it? Amazing. And I know you're a big fan of kind of Japanese cinema and Asian horror. Have you had a chance to check out this movie called Door yet, from 1989?
No.
So have you heard about this? This was the movie that was basically lost. So it's this obscure Japanese horror from the late 80s, and there was, for whatever reason, the print of it was just gone, and it's never ever been shown in the UK until recently at Grimfest in Manchester. It had its UK premiere. We hosted a screening of it and a panel, and it's a home invasion movie, and it's
cool.
really good, and it's got some incredibly weird, brilliant, classic kind of Japanese horror kind of moments in it. I think you'd really love it as well. It's definitely worth a watch if you get a chance.
I mean, I'm always up for new films and East Asia and the home in different contexts is so fascinating, isn't it? How it works, and a newfound classic is always a special treat.
It's so good. I've got a feeling it's getting its DVD or Blu-ray. It's like physical media release soon, I think, in the UK. So yeah, definitely worth checking out. Incredible. Well, James, thank you so much for joining me. As ever, you've been absolutely amazing. And just remind people where they can find you, more of your work. You've got a book published now as well. Tell us a little bit about where they can find more of your stuff.
I got a book that came out this summer called Transmedia Terror in Post-TV Horror.
Love it.
That's an Amsterdam University Press book that looks at the rise of graphic horror in the 21st century, but also its kind of proliferation, and also moving into what do we now call TV, Twitch and YouTube and stuff like that. And then the other half of the book is horror audiences. So as I've said before, part of my research interest are horror audiences. I'm so fascinated by how people respond to horror and make meaning around it. So yeah, that's available from wherever you get your books. You can drop me an email at james.rendell@southwales.ac.uk. I'm on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, James Rendell 87. I'm on Instagram at James Rendell _. And what's their version of Twitter called? Threads. I'm on Threads. I'm on. It was Blue Sky. I'm on that as well.
Blue Sky. This is the problem now when people come on here to list their socials. There's like 800 different platforms now.
I'm on that as well at James Rendell. I'm on the EOH Facebook groups. But yeah, I'm always happy to chat to people, and so hit me up.
Amazing. James, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's brilliant guest, James Rendell. What a fascinating pair of films to discuss with James. So grateful for him being here with all of his wonderful insights. Now, I would love to hear from you guys. What did you think of this week's discussion, and what do you think of these two films, The Feast and Men? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, there are two places you can go. You can join the Evolution of Horror Discord or the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which you can find on Facebook. If you want to support this podcast and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast platforms, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you use, as that always helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, well, we're nearly there. We've nearly reached the end, and we are close to wrapping up and concluding our home invasion series. But first, there are a few other films that we need to mop up. So next week, it's time for our Also Rand. So I'm going to be joined, of course, by Brad Hansen, and we are going to be rattling through a long list of other home invasion movies that were not discussed in depth on this series. So this is going to be simply a list of short, fast recommendations for you guys to jot down if you want to check out some other movies in this subgenre. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.